6 months have passed since the release of Grand Theft Auto Definitive Edition. This package of GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas was modernized with contemporary graphical techniques and translated over to modern consoles and PCs. While some aspects of the visuals, like the car rendering and particle effects, were considerably improved, the fundamental visual design was lost in translation from the original games. Plus, these new releases were plagued with glaring errors, including spelling and grammar issues, and performance was poor. But 6 months is a long time in game development, and there have been several major patches since those initial releases, which have a frankly enormous list of fixes, most of which resolve bugs, but some indeed purport to fix some of the visual issues that we identified in our original coverage. So what's changed here? Are these versions finally worth recommending? The definitive editions didn't exactly impress us the first time around. The basic lineage here is that these are ports of the mobile phone versions of GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas to Unreal Engine 4. Though the gameplay is largely the same, the graphics have seen considerable reworking, with a modern lighting and material system, completely redone character and vehicle assets, enhanced texture work, and post-processing niceties like SSAO and screen space reflections. There are some positive and negative aspects to the visual design here, which John and I covered in some detail in our original coverage. The basic gist here is that city areas hold up alright at a macro level, but suffer when you examine detail closely, and lack the color grading and stylization that defined the original releases. Characters look like they've been molded out of a mix of Play-Doh and plastic, and the animation work, which is largely copied from the originals, looks very awkward. These fundamental aspects of the visual design, as you might expect, are largely unchanged as of the latest patch. In broad strokes, we're still seeing the same presentation as the launch versions. But there are some key changes here that do manage to address some of the most pressing issues with the visuals, while leaving other areas curiously untouched. To demonstrate these changes, we'll mostly be comparing the game running on Xbox One X on patch 1.02, which is the mid-November patch that shipped on the disc release, with patch 1.04, which is the March patch and the most recent as of this recording. To start things off, the rain effect has been comprehensively improved. The original release had very strong rain that sorted behind water surfaces. It was eye-searingly bright and was difficult to see through at times, particularly given the relative darkness of the game during the night. As of patch 1.04, this effect is much improved. The actual density of the effect appears to be similar, but the transparency seems to have been dialed way up, particularly for the larger rain droplets that appear to be closer to the camera, giving the effect an appropriate level of coverage while not being distracting. All the sorting errors seem to have been fixed, so the rain now renders in front of water surfaces and doesn't penetrate overpasses or car interiors. Now fundamentally, the rain effect still appears to be a volume of rain that travels with the player. Notice in this scene how the raindrops never change their horizontal position relative to the player camera, even as we travel at high speed. Critically though, the rain no longer seems to track with the player's vertical velocity. This is a curious issue best highlighted in San Andreas, where diving in a jet would see the rain basically freeze in place. This has some base in physics, but looked really strange in practice, as the rain was still bounded to the player's horizontal movement. The patch 1.04 release solves this problem, with the rain now descending at a fixed rate regardless of the player's velocity relative to the ground. Perhaps some sort of middle ground would have worked well here, but I think this is a substantial improvement over the original. Speaking of San Andreas, one of the most annoying and off-putting visual issues with that game was the way the game looked from altitude. There was no haze or approximation of atmospheric scattering, which made the game world look incredibly small. Plus, the edge of the map was clearly visible, with water clearly stopping at some point not too far off the San Andreas landmass. As of patch 1.04, this has now been corrected. The game now has a ground haze option in the settings, which enables a sort of low-lying fog and haze layer that obscures distant geometry with some layers of alpha textures that actually look pretty good. As you ascend in altitude, these layers kind of awkwardly crossfade in, but once they're fully visible, the world does have a much more appropriate sense of distance and atmosphere. Plus, it looks sort of similar to the way that these effects rendered in the PS2 original, although unlike the PS2 release, you can fly far above them here. Many of the issues on signage have been fixed, though certainly not all, as we'll see later. Some of the spelling issues have been corrected. Our guitars has been rewritten in air guitars, and competitive has been changed to competitive, amongst other changes. These spelling and localization issues were common in the original release and are somewhat less present now. Plus, some of the textures that were reversed before have been flipped and now read correctly, though I still managed to spot a couple of doorways with backwards labels. Finally, I didn't notice that many bugs this time around. Most of the collision issues and problems with missions seem to have been resolved, as evidenced by the extensive patch notes. I did spot a couple issues still, one cutscene that froze in place in San Andreas, and geometry that refused to draw in GTA 3, but not nearly as much as before. So if that's what's been fixed, what's gone unaddressed? There are plenty of obvious flaws that still stick out. Grass, for instance, still has some misalignment issues throughout the remasters. These areas in Vice City exhibit grass that juts out at odd angles and hover over the ground, even as of the latest patch. Plus, I managed to catch a couple instances of foliage emerging out of nowhere in San Andreas, and some of the ground clutter in GTA 3 is still suspended above the ground. The Ambient Occlusion implementation also leaves a lot to be desired. It's very, very strong. Thick outlines encircle every piece of geometry that comes anywhere near a wall or other surface. Pedestrians, for instance, often appear surrounded by a dark glow. SSAO should be an easy visual win for the remaster, a cheap way to add ambient shading that would have been impractical to replicate on original PS2 hardware, but the implementation here is just way over the top. There are also some inconsistencies with material properties. The shiny beach from Vice City is still a problem. Grassy surfaces and roads also exhibit a bit of an odd sheen at times. PBR and specular properties are obviously new additions here, and they often look perfectly reasonable, but there are some exceptions. There are also some problems that are more fundamental to the visual design. Characters and animation work are probably the most prominent example. NPCs are rounded off with additional geometry and sport new materials work, which gives them a bit of a strange appearance. In motion, the results are often comic. The characters look sort of like sculptures that move awkwardly. The animation data was clearly not built from models at this level of fidelity. A substantial overhaul here is probably outside the scope of a typical post-release patching effort, but the characters still don't hold up at all.
I have been sitting in this chair all night with the lights off, drinking coffee. This is a disaster. We are so screwed, man.
Here's my final major outstanding issue with the remaster, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one, as it's a problem that's really stuck out to me the more I've played of the remasters over the past few months, and it really should still be fixable. The texture artwork in the remasters is really inconsistent, and still has obvious errors even 6 months out from release. Now, if we go back to the PS2 originals, texture quality obviously doesn't stand up to close scrutiny, with many textures just 128 by 128 pixels in size. On original hardware on a CRT, it looks decent enough, but blown up to high resolution, as in the PS2 Classics versions on PS4 for instance, texture quality needs serious work. So the remaster uses 3 general techniques to bring texture quality up to modern standards. AI upscaling is used frequently, which is a technique that uses machine learning to smartly enhance and clean up detail in the low-resolution source artwork. Some assets are redrawn, hewing close to the original style but with far greater resolution. Finally, some assets are flat out replaced, with new art that can look quite different from the original work. But the results often don't work with the look of the original game. Take a look at this sign, for instance. This has been redrawn with high-resolution artwork, but if you look closely, you can see just how lifeless some of the recreated assets are. The bold English text and brush-style Chinese calligraphy are absent in the redrawn artwork, with stock, thin fonts in their place. The original sign looks like a proper eye-catching advertisement, and the remake looks closer to programmer art. The AI upscaled artwork mostly holds up okay, but it never really sits that well at the high resolutions the game is being presented at. The source artwork here is simply too low resolution to work properly with AI upscaling techniques. These signs, for instance, have telltale issues, where the upscaling algorithm has problems distinguishing between pixelation artifacts and intended detail. The results are serviceable enough and can actually look passable in some areas, but often look grimy and messy. Some of the AI upscaled text elements are particularly rough. This sign, for example, looks smudged in the remake, with an "an" reading almost like an "am." Why wasn't this text redrawn? It seems like the bare minimum of attention to detail would have been enough here, but alas, we are left with this ugly upscaled texture. AI upscaling itself is a useful technique in game remastering efforts, and works very well in the Mass Effect Legendary Edition remasters, for instance. But the source material has to meet a minimum threshold of quality that most of this artwork does not. These issues are particularly curious given the fact that higher resolution artwork is actually available for these titles, artwork that doesn't seem to have been used for these remasters. Enter the Grand Theft Auto double pack for the original Xbox console. In addition to reworked models, animations, and reflections, these ports of GTA 3 and Vice City included higher resolution textures for many surfaces. These are a mix of redrawn and resampled textures, and crucially they offer much higher detail than those available on PS2, up to 4 times the resolution. Here's a comparison. This is the Definitive Edition running with textures from each version, the PS2 release, the Xbox release, and the Definitive Edition release overlaid. The Xbox textures offer the cleanest results here by far, and a quick AI upscaling pass produces an even crisper image. Using the Xbox texture seems like a good idea here, especially given the poor quality of the AI upscaled PS2 asset. But there's one final issue with the artwork, and it's tough to forgive. There are still spelling and grammatical errors present in these remakes. To be fair, some of these mistakes have indeed been fixed, as noted before. Torsers becomes trousers, as of patch 1.04 for instance. But some oversights remain. Gearboxes is still bareboxes. Screamin' Collins still doesn't have the apostrophe. These appear to be redrawn assets that have been mistranscribed. Some of the AI upscaled artwork has grammatical problems as well. Tiny becomes my on this storefront for instance, and wood becomes mood. Both gags from the original game are rendered incomprehensible as a result. Presumably the algorithm here is having trouble distinguishing between these similar looking combinations of letters, but they are certainly very readable in their original renditions. Again, this shouldn't have passed quality assurance and needs to be redrawn, both to preserve the original meaning of the artwork and to provide a passable level of clarity. Unfortunately, even if all these issues were corrected, the textures still wouldn't sit well within the environment. Because environmental geometric detail is largely unchanged from the PS2 releases, these textures are stretched over relatively large, relatively flat surfaces, making them look rather unrealistic. Oftentimes these give off the impression of an HD texture mod for an older title, with the polygonal limits of the source assets very much exposed. There are some obvious normal maps that do add in a subtle appearance of geometry on some surfaces, but many structures just look composed of perfectly flat planes. Perhaps some form of height map based displacement technique like parallax occlusion mapping would have been a good choice. Much of the environment just looks flat and barren, which really undercuts the relative sophistication of the other rendering techniques here. I'm sympathetic to the enormous task in front of the development team. 3 massive games with a ton of textures to rework and enhance, but the results here simply aren't up to par. I hinted at a big improvement at the start of this video, so here it is. Frame rates, at least on the current gen consoles, are hugely enhanced. The performance modes now run at a close to locked 60 FPS, which is a huge upgrade from the launch release. Now it's not perfect. There's the occasional duplicate frame or two that can crop up while traversing the environment, and certain cutscenes can sometimes drop frames. Stress testing the game with explosions and alpha effects can pull frame rates into the 50s on all current gen consoles however, though this isn't typical of most gameplay. There is one change worth noting here as well. The Ps5 Performance Mode no longer retains the Fidelity Mode volumetric clouds and screen space reflections as of recent patches, which partially explains that console's improved performance. But what about the Fidelity modes? These operate pretty similarly to how they did in the launch release. Frame rates are pegged to 30 FPS, but unfortunately suffer from the same frame pacing stutters that we saw at launch. They don't feel that great to play as a result, and the performance modes are much preferred here, though you do lose the volumetric clouds and rain puddles on all current gen consoles in these modes. On the plus side, Series X and PS5 do manage to run their fidelity modes without any load related dips, though I did spot a couple of instances where Series S would drop into the 20s for a few moments. Still, performance in these titles is much improved as of the latest patch. Fundamentally, this forms the key value proposition of the current gen releases as they stand right now. These older GTA titles are difficult to find in reasonable form on contemporary hardware. There's the glitchy and touch-based mobile phone versions, the horribly frame-paced PS2 Classics releases, the original PC games, which can be challenging to run on modern computers, and the 7th gen console ports of GTA San Andreas, which inherit all of the issues with the mobile phone releases. Given that context, GTA Definitive Edition isn't a bad way to enjoy these games, at least if you don't want to deal with headache-inducing technical issues. Yes, they may be riddled with visual annoyances, but they do run well, on current-gen consoles at least. A number of their most glaring issues have been fixed, and have modernized, revamped controls that compare favorably to the original releases. If you want to enjoy these games, there's a good case that the Definitive Edition may be the best way to play them for most people, and fundamentally that's a sad statement. These are some of the most critically acclaimed, highest selling games of all time, and deserve better than this set of flawed remakes. Many of the issues are difficult to excuse, particularly the problems with character rendering and texturing, but given the absence of a remaster or port with more respect for the source material, this isn't a bad option at the moment. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.